And then I asked if he could pay for my $30 nails, my feet. And he said, you don't got it.
Let me get this straight. You're sad because you found out your boyfriend is broke because he didn't have enough to pay for your nails, hair, whatever. But aren't you broke? That's the reason you're asking him for it? Bro, I promise you, most of these dudes will be so up if they didn't have a girlfriend. Girls be the biggest expense for every dude. If girls just simply had their own bread and spent their own bread, I promise you, oh my gosh, we would be so up. But no, you need your feet, you need your nails, you need gas in your car. You want niggas to pay your bills. You want niggas to do all this and you can't even do it for yourself, bro. Nobody wants to be a dad in this economy. Y'all women be so broke calling other niggas broke when y'all don't have y'all own bread. Y'all don't even be having enough money to splurge on your man here and there. Niggas can't even buy them a $60 PlayStation game. Just because your man wants to go 50-50, that doesn't mean he's broke. Maybe he's smart. He might be broke, but maybe he's smarter. Y'all broke, twin. Stop.
There is a quiet moment happening right now that most people are missing, and it is not loud, it is not dramatic, and it is not being led by protests or slogans. It is happening in silence, in empty inboxes, in unread messages, in unanswered calls, and in the absence of something that used to be taken for granted. What we are witnessing is not a sudden collapse, but a slow realization. And by the time most people notice it clearly, it will already be too late to reverse. Stay with me to the very end, because what we are talking about today explains why so many people feel confused, disoriented, and emotionally unanchored in ways they cannot quite put into words. Before we get into it, take a second to like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more Angry Guy content and you want every single video the moment we release it. It helps the channel more than you think, and it keeps these conversations alive. Also, if you want to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth in an unstable world, make sure you check out Angry's Crypto Academy. It is linked in the description of this video, and it teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly with a long-term mindset. If you are serious about staying ahead instead of reacting after the fact, go check it out now. And if you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and you want to show support, you can buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. It keeps the lights on, the research going, and the message consistent. Now let us talk about what is actually happening. Not the version that gets packaged into viral clips or reaction videos, but the underlying shift that is driving everything you are seeing. Across social media, particularly on short-form platforms, there is a growing wave of videos that all share the same emotional tone. Confusion, frustration, shock, sadness, women sitting in their cars, on their beds, in their apartments, staring into a camera and saying some version of the same thing. Where did all the men go? Why does no one approach me anymore? Why do messages go unanswered? Why does it feel like I am invisible? These are not isolated moments. They are symptoms of a larger change that has been building for years. For decades, men were told very clearly that their presence was unwanted, their attention was intrusive, their instincts were problematic, and their role in society was outdated. This was not subtle, it was explicit. Entire cultural movements were built around the idea that men needed to step back, stay quiet, and remove themselves unless invited. And now, for the first time, men are actually doing exactly that. What makes this moment so jarring is not that men are leaving, it is that they are leaving peacefully. There is no rebellion, no uprising, no dramatic exit. Men are simply opting out. They are not pursuing, they are not indeed initiating, they are not competing for attention, they are not trying to prove themselves. They are focusing inward, building quiet lives, and finding contentment without external validation. This was never supposed to happen. The assumption was always that men would complain but stay, that they would grumble but comply, that they would absorb the criticism and continue providing the same energy, attention, protection, and labor they always had. Instead, many men reached a point where they asked a simple question: what am I getting out of this? For a long time, the answer was clear. Men were given purpose through responsibility, through family, through partnership, through being needed. But when those roles were reframed as burdens, when male contribution was redefined as oppression, and when gratitude was replaced with suspicion, the incentive structure collapsed. This is where the misunderstanding begins. Many women believed that men would change in response to criticism, that men would adapt by becoming softer, more agreeable, more compliant. Instead, men adapted by becoming absent, not angry, not hostile, just gone. The emotional breakdowns you are seeing online are not about loneliness in the abstract. They are about the sudden removal of a social constant. For generations, male attention was a given. Even when it was inconvenient, even when it was unwanted, it was always there as a background presence. Now, that presence is fading, and the silence is louder than anyone expected. There is a narrative being pushed that this is temporary, that men will come back once they realize women are still there. That assumption misses the point entirely. Men did not leave because women disappeared. Men left because the cost of engagement exceeded the reward. Modern men are operating in an environment where one misstep can carry outsized consequences, where approaching the wrong person at the wrong time can result in social shaming, where normal human interactions are filtered through suspicion. When risk is high and reward is uncertain, rational actors disengage. What is rarely discussed is that men did not suddenly stop caring. They simply stopped volunteering. They stopped initiating. They stopped chasing validation in spaces that made them feel unwelcome. And in doing so, they discovered something unexpected: peace. Many men are finding fulfillment in simplicity, in routines, in hobbies, in self directed goals, in friendships that do not demand performance, in lives that are quieter but more stable. Once that switch flips, it is very difficult to turn it back. This is why the emotional tone of the response feels so raw, because it was never anticipated. The cultural script assumed that men needed women more than women needed men. What is becoming clear now is that interdependence was real. And when one side walks away, the imbalance becomes obvious. As broader economic pressures increase, this shift becomes even more pronounced. Inflation, housing costs, job instability, and social fragmentation all amplify the consequences of disconnection. When systems are stable, emotional gaps can be ignored. When systems strain, those gaps become survival issues. And historically, men played a central role in buffering uncertainty, not just financially, but emotionally and structurally. The removal of that buffer does not immediately cause collapse, but it accelerates stress. And stress reveals weaknesses that were previously hidden. This is not about assigning blame for the sake of blame. It is about acknowledging cause and effect. Cultural movements do not exist in a vacuum. Messages have consequences. Incentives shape behavior. When society tells one group repeatedly that they are unnecessary or harmful, eventually that group believes it. What we are seeing now is not a reversal of feminism or a sudden ideological shift. It is the long delayed response to decades of messaging. The bill is coming due, and many people are shocked because they were told there would be no cost. The most striking part of this moment is how unprepared many people are for male absence. There was no plan for it, no framework, no alternative structure. The assumption was that men would always be there, regardless of how they were treated. Men, however, are not disappearing into chaos. They are organizing quietly, building parallel lives, opting for minimalism, prioritizing mental health, choosing predictability over performance. This is not despair on the male side, it is recalibration. And that recalibration is what feels so destabilizing to those who relied on the old dynamic. When attention dries up, when effort is no longer offered freely, it forces a reckoning, not with men, but with expectations. The uncomfortable truth is that many of the women expressing shock are not reacting to male happiness, they are reacting to loss of leverage, to the realization that attention is not guaranteed. That effort must now be mutual. That attraction is not automatic. This moment did not arrive overnight. It was built slowly through policy, culture, media, and social reinforcement. Each step seemed small. Each message seemed justified in isolation. Together, they reshape behavior at scale. What happens next depends on whether there is an honest conversation about incentives, respect, and reciprocity, or whether denial continues, whether the response is reflection or resentment, whether accountability replaces entitlement. Men are not obligated to return to spaces that rejected them. Relationships are voluntary. Attention is voluntary. Engagement is voluntary. The idea that men owe participation simply because it once existed is a misunderstanding of human behavior. As systems become more strained, cooperation becomes more valuable, not less. The question is whether society can adjust before the gap becomes permanent. Because once people build lives without you, convincing them to come back requires more than nostalgia. Tough times are here. The 9 to 5 is history, and the creator economy is taking over. Join Angry's Creator Academy to learn how to build a thriving online business from scratch with minimal investment. Ditch the daily grind and flourish while others falter. Plus, sign up now and get our online business blueprint free. The Academy is linked in the description below. Go check it out now. And this is not the end of connection, but it is the end of assumptions. And the sooner that reality is understood, the more room there is for something healthier to emerge. Before we continue deeper into this, I want to pause and ask you to think about what you are seeing in your own life. The conversations that are no longer happening, the invitations that are no longer being extended, the quiet shifts that feel small but add up. To understand where this goes next, you have to look beyond dating apps and social media clips and start examining systems. Social behavior does not exist independently from economics, incentives, and long term stability. What people feel emotionally is often downstream from what they experience structurally. And right now, the structure is changing faster than most are prepared for. For a long time, society ran on an unspoken agreement. Our men would shoulder risk, responsibility, and long hours in exchange for meaning, respect, and a place within a shared future. Women would focus on social cohesion, family formation, and continuity. That arrangement was never perfect, but it functioned because both sides believed the trade was worthwhile. When that belief erodes, the entire system starts to wobble. What replaced that agreement was not a new stable model, but a series of ideological experiments layered on top of one another. Men were told they were not needed, but still expected to provide. Women were told they did not need men, but still expected men to show up when things got hard. That contradiction could only hold for so long. As costs of living increased, as work became more precarious, and as social trust declined, men began running their own internal calculations. If partnership no longer offers stability, if family formation is legally and financially risky, and if social narratives frame male contribution as suspect, then opting out becomes the rational choice. This is why the current moment feels so abrupt, even though it has been decades in the making. Systems fail slowly, then suddenly. The slow part was cultural messaging. The sudden part is behavioral withdrawal. You can see this clearly in how men talk about their goals now. Fewer men are oriented around building families. More are oriented around self sufficiency. They talk about smaller living spaces, fewer possessions, remote work, and financial independence. Not because they hate women, but because they no longer see a clear upside to traditional pathways. This shift also explains why so many women are experiencing emotional whiplash. The messaging they received promised empowerment without loss, independence without trade offs, strength without solitude. What is being discovered now is that independence also means isolation when mutual reliance is removed. There is an unspoken grief in many of these viral videos, not just grief over romantic prospects, but grief over a future that was assumed rather than built. When expectations collide with reality, the emotional fallout can be severe. Another layer that cannot be ignored is safety. For all the rhetoric around empowerment, there is a reason societies historically valued male participation. Not because women are incapable, but because physical reality exists. As social order becomes more strained, the absence of men from public life has consequences that no amount of slogans can offset. This does not mean chaos tomorrow. It means increased vulnerability over time, less informal protection, fewer people willing to intervene, more reliance on institutions that are already overstretched. When men disengage, they do not just stop dating, they stop volunteering, they stop mentoring, they stop participating. What fills that gap is rarely something better. Usually it is bureaucracy, surveillance, or neglect. None of those build trust or resilience. This is why dismissing this shift as bitterness or online theatrics is a mistake. The men who are leaving are not the loudest ones. They are not the ones posting rants. They are the ones quietly restructuring their lives and disappearing from spaces that no longer serve them. And once someone has built a life that is stable, predictable, and peaceful, it is very hard to convince them to re enter chaos. That is the part few people want to acknowledge. Another uncomfortable truth is that many men are discovering that their baseline needs are simpler than they were led to believe. They do not need constant stimulation. They do not need status games. They do not need external validation. When stripped down to essentials, many men are content with autonomy, purpose, and calm. This realization changes the power dynamic entirely. When someone is no longer desperate for approval, they become impossible to manipulate. That is deeply unsettling for systems built on leverage. On the other side, many women were socialized around relational centrality. Community, connection, and emotional exchange were emphasized. When those networks weaken and male participation declines, the sense of loss is immediate and visceral. The result is not villainy, it is misalignment. Two groups responding rationally to different incentives, only now realizing that the shared space between them has shrunk dramatically. Economic pressure accelerates all of this. Dual income households were once a choice. Increasingly, they are a necessity. When partnership rates decline, financial stress rises. When stress rises, conflict follows. When conflict follows, trust erodes further. This feedback loop is already visible. It is important to say clearly that this is not about men versus women. It is about narratives versus reality. When ideology ignores trade offs, reality eventually reasserts itself. The current generation is learning this lesson in real time. Younger men are watching older men step back and choosing not to step forward. Younger women are watching expectations crumble and wondering why no one warned them. There were warnings, they were just inconvenient. One of the most striking patterns is how often women frame this moment as confusion rather than reflection. They ask why men are not trying, but rarely ask what men are being asked to risk. They ask where the good men went, but rarely ask what happens to good men in hostile environments. Men noticed, men adjusted. This does not mean reconciliation is impossible. It means it cannot happen without honesty, without acknowledging that respect is not optional, that attraction is not enforceable, that participation must be mutually beneficial. If the response to male withdrawal is more shaming, more coercion, or more moralizing, the divide will deepen. If the response is curiosity, accountability, and recalibration, there is still room to rebuild. But rebuilding requires letting go of the idea that the past can simply be restored. It cannot. The conditions that created it no longer exist. Another factor that deserves attention is technology. Digital platforms magnified extremes. They rewarded outrage, simplified narratives, and flattened nuance. Men and women were shown caricatures of each other until those caricatures felt real. As men step away from those platforms, they also step away from the emotional volatility that came with them. That alone improves quality of life. Many men report feeling calmer, more focused, and less anxious after disengaging. That is not an accident. Constant exposure to conflict without resolution is psychologically draining. Removing oneself from it is a form of self preservation. Women, meanwhile, often remain deeply embedded in these platforms because social connection has been digitized. When those spaces turn hostile or empty, the sense of loss is amplified. This asymmetry creates a misunderstanding. Men leave and feel relief. Women stay and feel abandoned. Both experiences are real. Neither is being fully acknowledged. The broader question is what kind of society emerges from this? One where cooperation is rebuilt on clearer terms, or one where fragmentation continues until systems break under their own weight. History suggests that prolonged misalignment leads to instability. Not immediately, but inevitably. Social trust is not optional, it is foundational. That is why pretending this is just about dating misses the point. Dating is the visible surface. Underneath it are questions about responsibility, obligation, and shared future. When men no longer feel invested in that future, they stop contributing to it. When women no longer feel supported, they become fearful and reactive. Neither leads to prosperity. There is still time to adjust course, but adjustment requires humility on all sides. It requires admitting that some messages went too far, that some incentives were misaligned, that some assumptions were wrong. Men walking away is not a threat, it is feedback. Ignoring feedback does not make it go away, it makes it louder later. As you watch these emotional moments play out online, ask yourself what is being revealed beneath the tears. Not just sadness, but surprise. Surprise that actions had consequences. Surprise that absence can be more powerful than presence. To understand how deep this goes, you have to zoom out and look at demographics rather than individual stories. Personal experiences feel isolated, but when millions of people make similar decisions for similar reasons, the outcome becomes structural. Declining birth rates, delayed family formation, and shrinking households are not random trends. They are downstream effects of disengagement. When men step away from long term commitment, family formation slows. When family formation slows, entire economic models begin to strain. Housing markets, education systems, healthcare planning, and labor pipelines all assume a steady renewal of population. When that assumption breaks, pressure builds everywhere at once. And this is why governments and institutions are quietly panicking while public messaging remains calm. You can see it in policy incentives, tax credits, media campaigns, and cultural pushes that suddenly emphasize connection and community. These are not organic shifts, they are responses to data. What makes this moment unique is that the usual levers are no longer working. Incentives that once pulled men back into participation no longer have the same effect. Promises of status ring hollow. Appeals to duty fall flat when duty has been reframed as exploitation for years. Men are not rejecting responsibility itself, they are rejecting asymmetric responsibility. They are rejecting systems where risk is privatized and reward is uncertain. This distinction matters because it explains why so many attempts to shame men back into compliance fail. Shame only works on people who care about approval from the group doing the shaming. Many men no longer do. As men build parallel lives, they also build parallel values. Time becomes more valuable than recognition. Peace becomes more valuable than excitement. Predictability becomes more valuable than passion. These are not flaws, they are adaptations. Women, meanwhile, are being forced to confront a reality they were not prepared for. Independence sounds empowering until independence means doing everything alone. Choice feels liberating until choice is narrow. Freedom feels expansive until it comes without support. This does not mean women are incapable. It means systems were built assuming cooperation. Removing cooperation changes the burden distribution dramatically. One of the most telling patterns is how often emotional distress is framed as confusion rather than consequence. Many women express disbelief that men are not responding, not pursuing, not initiating. The disbelief itself reveals how deeply male effort was assumed. For generations, men were expected to make the first move, take the first risk, absorb rejection, and continue regardless. That expectation did not disappear when criticism increased. It simply became invisible until it was withdrawn. Now that withdrawal has happened, the silence feels personal, but it is systemic. Another factor accelerating this shift is legal and financial exposure. Men are more informed than ever about long term risks. They share information, they compare outcomes, they watch what happens to others and adjust accordingly. When risk is concentrated on one side of a decision, participation declines. This is basic human behavior. Ignoring it does not change it. The idea that men should simply accept unfavorable odds out of tradition or morality misunderstands modern decision making. Men today are not bound by the same social enforcement mechanisms as previous generations. They can leave quietly and still survive. This ability to exit changes everything. When exit is possible, voice becomes optional. Many men skip the argument entirely and choose absence instead. The emotional gap this creates is not immediately obvious because absence is gradual. Fewer conversations, fewer invitations, fewer shared experiences. Over time, social fabric thins. This thinning shows up in subtle ways: fewer marriages, more single households, increased reliance on state support, higher rates of anxiety and burnout. These are not moral failures, they are signals. What complicates the conversation is that admitting these signals challenges deeply held narratives. It requires acknowledging that some cultural assumptions were incomplete. That empowerment without reciprocity creates imbalance. That autonomy without interdependence creates fragility. Many people resist this acknowledgement because it feels like regression. It is not, it is recalibration. Healthy systems evolve by integrating feedback, not denying it. Right now, the feedback is loud, even when expressed quietly. Men are saying, through action rather than words, that participation must make sense. That effort must be met with respect. That sacrifice must be recognized. These are not extreme demands, they are foundational. The danger comes when feedback is ignored long enough that disengagement becomes permanent. Once norms reset around absence, rebuilding presence becomes exponentially harder. You can see this already in younger generations. Boys growing up now are watching older men opt out and learning from it. They are internalizing caution as wisdom. They are learning that silence can be safer than exposure. This shapes behavior long before dating even begins. It shapes ambition, risk tolerance, and trust. Once formed, these patterns persist. Women growing up in this environment face a different challenge. They are told they can have everything, but rarely told that everything requires alignment. When reality diverges from promise, frustration builds. Neither side benefits from this disconnect, but benefits are not evenly distributed. Systems under strain tend to externalize costs. Someone always pays. As social cohesion weakens, institutional control increases. Rules replace trust. Procedures replace norms. Surveillance replaces community. This is not speculative. It is observable. When informal cooperation declines, formal enforcement expands. This affects everyone, regardless of ideology. Men withdrawing from public engagement does not create freedom. It creates vacuum. Vacuums get filled. This is why the conversation cannot stay stuck at blame. Blame is easy. Repair is hard. Repair requires acknowledging that men and women are not interchangeable units. They bring different tendencies, strengths, and vulnerabilities. Designing systems that ignore this reality leads to failure. For a long time, society attempted to flatten differences in the name of fairness. In doing so, it ignored function. Function always reasserts itself. The return of reality is rarely gentle. It does not care about narratives. It responds to incentives. Right now, incentives are misaligned. Men are incentivized to disengage. Women are incentivized to expect. Institutions are incentivized to deny. That triangle cannot hold indefinitely. The longer the gap persists, the more resentment builds, not necessarily expressed outwardly, but internalized. Quiet resentment is more corrosive than loud conflict because it offers no release. Many of the men who leave do not hate anyone. They are not angry. They are simply done negotiating for basic respect. Many of the women who struggle are not entitled villains. They are responding to a reality that contradicts what they were told. Both sides are casualties of mismanaged expectations. The solution, if one exists, begins with honesty, honest assessment of incentives, honest discussion of risk, honest acknowledgement of trade offs. Without that, attempts to force outcomes will backfire. You cannot legislate attraction. You cannot shame people into commitment. You cannot coerce genuine cooperation. What you can do is create conditions where cooperation makes sense again, where effort is valued, where respect flows both ways, where responsibility is shared. That requires cultural humility. It requires admitting that some slogans overshot reality, that some movements ignored unintended consequences. This is difficult because it challenges identity. But systems that prioritize identity over function eventually fail. As this shift continues, more people will notice its effects in everyday life, in workplaces, in neighborhoods, in social spaces that feel emptier than they used to. The question is not whether men will come back on command, they will not. The question is whether a new equilibrium can form that does not rely on guilt or nostalgia. Equilibrium requires balance. Balance requires adjustment. Adjustment requires letting go of certainty. The men who are gone are not waiting to be convinced. They are waiting to see if conditions change. Many will never return. Some might if the environment feels fundamentally different. That difference cannot be cosmetic. It cannot be branding. It has to be structural. Until then, the quiet will continue. And for those who assumed noise would always fill the space, that quiet will feel unbearable. When people hear the phrase demographic collapse, they often imagine something distant and abstract, like charts on a government report or warnings from economists that never quite touch everyday life. In reality, demographic decline shows up in very ordinary ways long before headlines catch up. It shows up as fewer people entering the workforce, fewer families forming, fewer children being born, and fewer informal support systems holding communities together. As populations age and shrink, the burden on those who remain increases. Fewer workers support more dependents. Fewer contributors fund more obligations. This is not a moral judgment, it is arithmetic. And arithmetic does not negotiate. In past generations, family structures absorbed much of this pressure. Men worked longer hours, women managed households, extended families shared responsibilities. Those arrangements were not perfect, but they distributed load in a way that prevented systemic overload. As those structures weaken, the load shifts to institutions. Institutions are not designed to replace human relationships. They are designed to manage processes. When forced to fill emotional and social gaps, they become bloated, inefficient, and impersonal. People feel managed rather than supported. This is where the absence of men becomes more than a cultural talking point. Men have historically occupied a disproportionate share of physically demanding, high risk, and infrastructure sustaining roles. When fewer men participate, those systems strain. This does not mean women cannot perform these roles. It means fewer people want to perform them at all under current conditions. When risk is high and social reward is low, participation declines across the board. The result is a slow erosion of resilience. Roads decay, services thin, response times lengthen. None of this feels dramatic day to day. It accumulates quietly until something breaks. In times of abundance, societies can afford inefficiency. In times of scarcity, inefficiency becomes dangerous. This is why male disengagement during periods of economic and social stress is particularly consequential. It removes a stabilizing force at the exact moment stability is most needed. At the individual level, many men describe feeling lighter after disengaging, less pressure, fewer expectations, more control over time and energy. That personal relief does not automatically translate to collective benefit. What feels like freedom to the individual can feel like abandonment to the system. Both perceptions can be true simultaneously. Women, on the other hand, often experience this transition as a sudden increase in vulnerability. Tasks that were once shared now feel heavier. Emotional labor that was once distributed feels concentrated. The absence is felt not as choice, but as loss. This emotional disparity fuels misunderstanding. Men see withdrawal as self preservation, women experience it as rejection. Without a shared framework to interpret the change, resentment grows on both sides. Media narratives often make this worse by flattening complexity into blame. Men are portrayed as selfish, women are portrayed as unreasonable. Neither framing addresses the underlying incentives driving behavior. The truth is less dramatic and more unsettling. People respond to environments. Change the environment and behavior follows. For years, men were told their traditional roles were obsolete, even harmful. At the same time, no clear alternative role was offered that carried equivalent respect or meaning. The message was removal without replacement. When a system removes purpose without providing a substitute, disengagement is inevitable. Women were told they could have autonomy without trade offs. That reliance was optional. That structure was unnecessary. Those messages were empowering in theory, but incomplete in practice. When autonomy becomes isolation, the emotional cost is steep. This is why many of the reactions you see now are not ideological arguments, but emotional breakdowns. People are confronting a gap between expectation and lived experience. Bridging that gap requires more than reassurance, it requires recalibrating expectations. One of the most overlooked aspects of this shift is how it affects trust. Trust is built through repeated positive interaction. When interaction decreases, trust decays. As men and women interact less frequently and more cautiously, assumptions fill the void. Those assumptions are rarely charitable. Men assume hostility, women assume indifference. Both assumptions discourage engagement. This feedback loop accelerates disengagement. Fewer interactions lead to less trust. Less trust leads to fewer interactions. Breaking that loop requires intentional effort, not slogans, not shame, not nostalgia, effort. That effort has to start with acknowledging reality as it is, not as it was promised to be. Another uncomfortable factor is that many men who disengage discover they are happier than expected. This undermines the narrative that men need constant companionship to function. It reveals that much of male participation was driven by obligation rather than desire. Once obligation is removed, only genuine alignment remains. That is a higher bar, but a healthier one. For women accustomed to being pursued, this shift can feel like rejection of worth. In reality, it is rejection of obligation. Separating those two concepts is emotionally difficult. Worth and attention were tightly coupled for a long time. Untangling them creates confusion. This confusion is amplified by economic pressure. As living costs rise, the practical benefits of partnership become more obvious. When partnership becomes harder to form, anxiety increases. Historically, men were expected to absorb financial volatility. That expectation has not disappeared, even as the social incentives supporting it have weakened. Many men respond by minimizing exposure, smaller homes, fewer commitments, simpler lives. This reduces risk, but also reduces interdependence. Interdependence is what allows societies to absorb shocks. Without it, systems become brittle. A brittle system can function for a time, but it shatters under stress. This is why the long term implications matter. A society with declining cooperation faces challenges that cannot be solved with policy alone. Policies can incentivize behavior temporarily, they cannot create trust. Trust emerges from shared experience and mutual respect. Right now, respect feels conditional on ideology rather than behavior. That is corrosive. Men feel respected only if they conform to certain narratives. Women feel respected only if their struggles are affirmed without question. Neither approach fosters cooperation. Cooperation requires space for disagreement without dehumanization. As male withdrawal continues, the remaining interactions become more polarized. Extreme voices dominate because moderate voices exit. This creates the illusion that conflict is increasing when, in reality, participation is decreasing. Silence does not trend, extremes do, and this distorts perception. People believe the divide is wider than it is, which further discourages engagement. In reality, many men and women want similar things: stability, respect, purpose, safety, connection. What they differ on is how those things are achieved and what costs are acceptable. Those differences are negotiable. What is not negotiable is reality. Reality is that sustained disengagement has consequences that compound over time. Reality is that systems built on assumed participation fail when participation becomes optional. The question is whether adaptation happens proactively or reactively. Reactive adaptation is painful. Proactive adaptation requires humility. Humility is difficult in cultures that equate certainty with strength. Admitting miscalculation feels like defeat. In truth, it is course correction. The longer course correction is delayed, the steeper it becomes. Men walking away is not a fad. It is a signal that the old equilibrium no longer holds. Ignoring that signal does not restore equilibrium. It accelerates breakdown. As more men build lives that function independently, the leverage to demand their return diminishes. Participation becomes something that must be earned rather than expected. This is a fundamental shift. It affects relationships, workplaces, communities, and governance. And it also changes how people define success. Traditional markers lose relevance, new ones emerge. For men, success increasingly looks like autonomy and peace. For women, success increasingly looks like stability and support. These definitions are not incompatible, but they require alignment, and alignment cannot be achieved through force. It must be built through trust. Trust cannot be built in an environment saturated with suspicion. This brings us to the core challenge. Can society recalibrate fast enough to prevent long term fragmentation? Fragmentation does not announce itself, it settles in quietly. People retreat, systems strain, expectations lower, quality declines. Eventually, people accept less because they expect less. That is not collapse, it is decay. Decay can persist for a long time before failure becomes visible. The opportunity to reverse decay exists early, not late. That opportunity lies in honest dialogue, shared accountability, and willingness to abandon narratives that no longer serve. Whether that opportunity is seized remains to be seen. When you look at younger generations through this lens, the picture becomes even more concerning because children do not form expectations based on theory. They form expectations based on observation. What they see modeled becomes normal, what they see rewarded becomes desirable, and what they see punished becomes avoided. Boys growing up today are not absorbing lessons from textbooks or lectures. They are watching men around them disengage quietly. They are watching older brothers, uncles, coworkers, and online figures choose distance over participation. They are learning early on that visibility carries risk and that silence carries safety. This shapes how boys think about ambition. Instead of asking how to contribute, many ask how to avoid exposure. Instead of striving to lead, they learn to minimize attention. Instead of imagining future families, they imagine future insulation from risk. That is not because they are lazy or broken, it is because they are rational. Girls growing up in the same environment absorb a different lesson. They are told they are strong and independent, but they observe exhaustion. They are told they can do everything, but they see people struggling to do it alone. They are told support is optional, but they feel its absence. This creates internal tension. The message says one thing, reality shows another. When those conflict, anxiety grows. Children raised in misaligned systems do not rebel immediately. They adapt quietly. They lower expectations. They hedge emotionally. They delay commitment. Over time, this becomes culture. A culture built on hedging is not resilient. It is cautious, fragmented, and brittle. The normalization of disengagement has long term consequences that are difficult to reverse because they become embedded in identity. Once someone defines themselves around independence from others, reintegration feels like loss, not gain. This is especially true for men who have found peace in solitude. Asking them to re enter chaotic systems feels like asking them to give up hard won stability. For women who grew up expecting partnership as a given, the absence feels like betrayal by a system that promised security without explaining conditions. Both experiences are valid, neither is being reconciled. Education systems rarely address this honestly. Media narratives often obscure it. Policy discussions sidestep it. That leaves individuals to process it alone. When people process large structural shifts alone, they personalize what is systemic. They blame themselves or each other rather than the environment. This personalization fuels shame and resentment. Shame leads to withdrawal. Resentment leads to hostility. Both reduce cooperation. The irony is that most people want similar outcomes. They want safety, they want respect, they want predictability, they want connection that does not feel transactional. What they do not want is exposure without protection, obligation without appreciation, or sacrifice without meaning. For decades, meaning was supplied externally through tradition, through religion, through community norms. As those weakened, meaning became individualized. Individualized meaning is flexible but fragile. It relies heavily on personal stability. When personal stability is threatened, meaning collapses quickly. This is why so many emotional responses feel disproportionate. They are not about one rejection or one lonely night, they are about identity destabilization. When a woman realizes that male attention is not guaranteed, it challenges more than dating prospects. It challenges narratives about worth, desirability, and future security. When a man realizes he can opt out and feel better, it challenges narratives about duty, masculinity, and social obligation. Both realizations are destabilizing in different ways. The mistake many make is assuming one side must be wrong for the other to be right. That framing guarantees conflict. A healthier framing is that the system failed to align incentives with reality. When incentives fail, behavior shifts. Blaming individuals for adapting is misguided. This brings us to the question of responsibility. Not blame, but responsibility. Responsibility lies with those who shape narratives without accounting for consequences, with institutions that encourage dependency while dismantling cooperation, with cultural leaders who promise liberation without discussing cost. Responsibility also lies with individuals to respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. It is easier to double down on ideology than to admit miscalculation, but doubling down widens the gap. Men withdrawing further reduces opportunities for positive interaction. Women responding with anger reinforces male caution. The cycle feeds itself. Breaking the cycle requires someone to move first without guarantee of reciprocity. That is risky. In low trust environments, risk is avoided. This is why rebuilding trust takes longer than breaking it. Trust is not restored through declarations. It is restored through consistent, low risk, positive interaction over time. That requires spaces where men do not feel targeted and women do not feel dismissed. Those spaces are rare right now. Online environments reward outrage. Offline environments are increasingly isolated. The middle ground has eroded. Rebuilding it requires intentional design, not slogans, not campaigns, designing environments where cooperation is rewarded rather than punished, where disagreement does not lead to social exile, where effort is acknowledged even when outcomes are imperfect. This is difficult in cultures addicted to moral certainty. Certainty feels safe, ambiguity feels dangerous, but ambiguity is where negotiation lives. The longer ambiguity is avoided, the more rigid positions become. Rigid positions eventually snap. We are already seeing this snap at the margins: increased polarization, increased loneliness, increased mental health strain, increased reliance on external systems to replace internal cohesion. None of these trends reverse on their own. They reverse when incentives change. Incentives change when people experience tangible benefits from cooperation. Again, not hypothetical benefits, real ones. Men will not re engage because they are told to. They will re engage if participation improves quality of life. Women will not feel secure because they are told they are empowered. They will feel secure when support structures are reliable. This does not require returning to the past. It requires acknowledging biological, psychological, and social realities rather than denying them. Equality does not mean sameness. Fairness does not mean symmetry in all things. Ignoring difference does not eliminate it, it distorts it. Healthy systems leverage difference, they do not flatten it. The current system attempted flattening and is now experiencing distortion. As this distortion continues, more people will quietly disengage, not just men from women, but people from institutions, communities, and shared projects. Disengagement spreads when participation feels futile. This is the danger zone. When enough people disengage, systems lose legitimacy. When legitimacy erodes, enforcement replaces consent. That path does not lead to flourishing. The alternative path is slower and harder. It involves recalibrating expectations on all sides. It involves acknowledging trade offs without moral panic. It involves rebuilding trust incrementally. Incremental rebuilding is unglamorous. It does not go viral. It does not satisfy outrage, but it works. The challenge is whether enough people value long term stability over short term validation. Men walking away is a rational response to perceived imbalance. Women expressing despair is a rational response to unexpected absence. Rational responses can still lead to collective failure if left unaddressed. The purpose of discussing this openly is not to assign guilt, but to surface reality before it hardens into inevitability. Once disengagement becomes the default expectation, reversing it requires extraordinary effort. We are not fully there yet, but we are closer than many realize. If this trajectory continues without correction, what emerges is not a dramatic collapse, but a quiet bifurcation of society into parallel lives that rarely intersect in meaningful ways. Men and women will still occupy the same physical spaces, but psychologically and socially, they will be operating on different wavelengths. Shared assumptions dissolve first, shared goals follow. Eventually, shared reality fractures. Parallel societies do not announce themselves. They form when people stop expecting to be understood by those outside their group. Communication becomes surface level. Interaction becomes transactional. Empathy becomes conditional. Over time, people stop trying to bridge gaps because the effort feels wasted. Men who have disengaged build lives optimized for low friction, smaller social circles, fewer emotional obligations, clear boundaries, predictable routines. These lives are not empty, they are efficient. They trade intensity for stability. Women navigating increasing isolation often respond differently. Some double down on independence. Some seek community elsewhere. Some oscillate between anger and grief. The emotional load is heavier because relational expectation was higher. This divergence creates asymmetrical pain. Men experience relief first, women experience loss first. That difference in timing fuels misunderstanding. Because men feel better, they are accused of indifference. Because women feel worse, they are accused of entitlement. Both accusations miss the deeper issue, which is that the system changed without preparing anyone for the consequences. As parallel lives solidify, re-entry costs rise. The longer someone has lived independently, the more disruptive reintegration feels. Habits calcify, preferences sharpen, tolerance for chaos diminishes. This is why waiting for things to naturally balance out is unrealistic. Time alone does not heal structural misalignment, it entrenches it. The idea that a crisis will force reconnection is also flawed. Crises do not automatically produce cooperation. They often intensify fragmentation when trust is low. In high trust societies, crisis pulls people together. In low trust societies, crisis pushes people further apart. Right now, trust is fragile. You can see this fragility in how quickly interactions escalate into conflict, how easily disagreement becomes moral condemnation, how often intent is assumed rather than clarified. This environment punishes vulnerability. When vulnerability is punished, people armor up. Armored people do not connect easily. Men armor by withdrawing. Women armor by controlling. Both are protective strategies. Both reduce intimacy. The tragedy is that most people want intimacy. They just do not feel safe pursuing it. Safety is not only physical, it is reputational, emotional, legal, social. When safety erodes across multiple dimensions, disengagement becomes the safest option. This is not cowardice, it is adaptation. The longer adaptation persists, the more it becomes identity. Identity is harder to negotiate than behavior. Once someone says, "This is just who I am now," persuasion stops working. That is the danger point. We are approaching a phase where disengagement is no longer framed as a response, but as a preference. When that happens, incentives lose power. At that stage, appeals to duty or nostalgia fall flat. People do not miss what they no longer value. Value shifts quietly. Many men now value peace more than partnership. Many women value stability more than ideology. These values are not opposed, but they are misaligned in practice. Alignment requires compromise. Compromise requires trust. Trust requires good faith. Good faith has been eroded by years of adversarial framing. Rebuilding good faith starts with acknowledging pain on both sides without immediately ranking it. Competitive suffering prevents resolution. When pain is validated selectively, resentment grows. Men need acknowledgement that withdrawal did not come from nowhere. Women need acknowledgement that absence hurts in ways that were not anticipated. Neither acknowledgement negates the other. What prevents this acknowledgement is fear. Fear that admitting trade offs undermines empowerment. Fear that admitting harm concedes moral ground. But moral ground does not matter if the system fails. Systems do not care who was right, they care whether inputs sustain outputs. Right now, inputs are declining. Declining participation leads to declining social capital. Declining social capital leads to declining resilience. Resilience is what allows societies to absorb shocks without breaking, and without it, small problems cascade. We have already seen glimpses of this: supply chain disruptions, labor shortages, institutional overload. These are not isolated incidents. They are early warnings. And when fewer people feel invested in the system, fewer people step up when needed. Men historically stepped into gaps during crisis, not because they were noble, but because their role was clear and valued. That clarity has been eroded. If a crisis demands sacrifice from people who feel unvalued, compliance will be low. This is not a threat, it is an observation. People protect what protects them. When protection feels one sided, loyalty dissolves. This reality forces a difficult question. What does a sustainable social contract look like now? It cannot be a return to the past. Conditions have changed, knowledge has spread, exit options exist. It also cannot be a continuation of denial. Denial delays adaptation. A sustainable contract must balance autonomy with interdependence, freedom with responsibility, choice with consequence. That balance requires honesty about differences. Men and women are not interchangeable units. Pretending otherwise creates blind spots. Acknowledging difference does not mean hierarchy, it means design. Well designed systems align incentives with reality. Poorly designed systems rely on coercion. Coercion works temporarily, it fails long term. You cannot force people to care. You can only create environments where caring makes sense. Right now, caring feels risky. Reducing risk requires restoring respect. Respect is demonstrated through boundaries, reciprocity, and accountability. Accountability has been uneven. That imbalance drives withdrawal. When one side feels perpetually judged and the other perpetually validated, cooperation erodes. This dynamic is unsustainable. What often happens next in such systems is overcorrection. Narratives swing hard in the opposite direction, resentment replaces guilt. That creates new victims without solving root problems. Avoiding overcorrection requires nuance. Nuance is unpopular, but it is necessary. Nuance means holding two truths at once: that men were criticized unfairly in many cases, that women face real challenges and fears, that both adapted rationally, that both are impacted negatively by fragmentation. Holding these truths simultaneously is uncomfortable. It resists simple villains, but simple villains do not fix complex systems. As disengagement normalizes, people begin planning around it. Cities designed for singles, markets adapt to smaller households, entertainment replaces community, consumption replaces connection. These adaptations keep things functioning superficially, but they hollow out depth. Depth is what sustains meaning over time. A shallow society can entertain itself for a long time before noticing emptiness. By then, rebuilding depth is difficult. This is why early intervention matters. Early does not mean immediate action, it means honest recognition. Recognition begins with conversations like this, not to inflame, but to illuminate. If enough people recognize the pattern, incentives begin to shift organically. Social norms adjust. Expectations recalibrate. But if recognition is suppressed, pressure builds until release becomes disruptive. Disruptive release is unpredictable. History is full of examples where ignored feedback led to sudden upheaval. The goal is not to predict catastrophe, it is to prevent it. Prevention is boring. It does not trend. It does not satisfy outrage. But it preserves stability. Men walking away is feedback. Women expressing despair is feedback. Institutional panic is feedback. Ignoring feedback is a choice. The choice now is whether to integrate that feedback constructively or let it harden into permanent division. Permanent division does not require hatred. It only requires apathy. Apathy is already spreading. People stop caring when caring feels costly and futile. Reversing apathy requires restoring hope that effort matters. Effort matters when it is reciprocated. Reciprocity cannot be mandated, it must be modeled. That modeling starts locally, in conversations, in boundaries, in expectations set early and clearly. It does not start with grand narratives, it starts with behavior. If enough people model healthier dynamics, norms shift gradually. If not, disengagement becomes default. Default behaviors are hard to undo. And I want to hear what you think about everything we discussed. Whether you agree, whether you disagree, whether you see these patterns playing out around you. Leave a comment and share your thoughts. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MNWA, men walking away. And cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.